Hey everyone, quick note about this episode before you get started. In this week's episode, we talk about sainthood and the life of Oscar Romero, who is a saint in the Episcopal Church. But parts of the conversation deal with some pretty sensitive topics, including violence and death. So these things could be a little triggering for some folks, and in particular, we may want to be careful if there are little ears listening. That being said, we hope you enjoy the show. This is For the Rest of Us with Canon Megan and Adam, a podcast about theology, faith, the Bible, and life. You know, for the rest of us. Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to the latest episode of For the Rest of Us with Canon Megan and Adam. I, as you have probably figured out by now, am not Canon Megan. My name is Adam Eichelberger. I'm the Director of Communications for the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York, and you can consider me the Amy Pond to Megan's Doctor Who as we navigate this wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey life together in the TARDIS that we like to call the Episcopal Church. So, Megan, I have talked before a lot about how I was not raised in the Episcopal Church. I was born and raised in the Roman Catholic Church. And one of the things that I think that you and most people know that Catholics are super duper big on is saints. We have this whole kind of like trading card system where we have created all of these saints in the church. And I, as a Catholic, am really familiar with the canonization process in the Catholic Church. But one of the things that really kind of jumped out at me as I started practicing the Episcopal faith is how the Episcopal Church looks at saints, which I realized I don't really know a whole lot about the process, but also how many differences there are. And I know you've got some great stuff about that, but like one of the things that's like jumped out to me, especially recently, is Martin Luther King is considered a saint in the Episcopal Church, which is really rad. But I am turning to you. You are Yoda in this situation. I'm going to be the Padawan and sit under the learning tree. Can you talk to us about how we in the Episcopal Church make saints?
Yeah, man. So like many things in the Episcopal Church, we have the idea from the Catholics, and then we are way kind of looser about it. So the idea is the same. Saints are paragons of faith in some way, shape, or form. They may not have been perfect people. I have a good example of that later, Florence Nightingale. But something about their faith is a good example for us. So the Episcopal Church way of making saints is that General Convention votes on whether or not a person is a saint. And if Convention votes yes, hooray, they get a commemoration on the calendar and they're a saint. Now, the way you get brought up for a vote at General Convention, and there are exceptions to this, but generally speaking, your local community, after your death, has to recognize you as a saintly person and has to develop a commemoration for you. And that commemoration has to occur on a consistent basis for a period of time. So one of the things that I find fascinating about saints throughout kind of the church's whole history is that developing saints, recognizing different people as saints, is one of the very few ways that the ordinary person has the ability to influence the hierarchy of the church. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the Middle Ages, who and what became a saint was one of the few ways that kind of popular opinion in Europe had the ability to move the Catholic hierarchy. And it's really fascinating because a lot of times somebody would start out as sort of like a not so popular person, then they would develop a cult of the saint, and then it would get adopted by the hierarchy, and then boom, everybody was happy. So we have the same idea, but it's sped up.
Got it.
So we don't do the miracles thing.
Okay, so that was one of my questions, because one of the things that we were really big on is there have to be miracles attributed to the person, and there's a very long process where there's like titles like servant of God, and then venerable, and then blessed, and then saint. So
we're just like, we like you. You seem sainty. Okay. Like C.S. Lewis is a saint. J.R.R. Tolkien, no kidding, is a saint in the Episcopal Church.
See, this is why I'm here. I'm here for this.
Yeah.
This is great.
Madeleine L'Engle, I think, is going to get a Saint's Day one of these days because she used to be the writer-in-residence at St. John the Divine, and she's super cool.
Awesome.
So she's probably going to get a Saint's Day. You do have to be dead for a while
Fair.
to make sure, like, you age, your memory ages well. We've had a couple saints that had to come off the calendar because they did not age super good. But the person we're going to talk about today became a saint super fast in the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, and the Anglican Communion. Took him much longer to become a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. And there were some reasons for that. But today, we're going to start a series called Better Know a Saint. Like Better Know a District from the Colbert Report. And we're going to be talking about Oscar Romero.
Love it. I love Oscar Romero, so this is good.
Me too. He's my guy. When I was in college and I thought I was called to be a priest, but I had also kind of left the church. And I was like, I don't know how you be a priest. I learned about Oscar Romero in a class, and I was like, oh, I don't know how to be a priest, but I could do that. I can do that thing. So we're going to talk about Oscar Romero, who, as I'm sure you know, Archbishop of El Salvador, who died in 1980. So it's current events. So how much do you know about him?
So I know that he's a huge part of like the movement of justice in like El Salvador in that time period. I know that he is largely attributed or accredited to the idea of things like liberation theology. And I know you said he died in the 1980s, but I think that saying that he died is kind of a nice way of putting it.
Yeah. He was martyred in 19.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, he is often associated with liberation theology. It's a more complicated story than that. He was a member of Opus Dei until the day he died. Went on retreat with Opus Dei on the day he died for clergy. He was super orthodox,
right,
in a lot of his thinking, which is one of the reasons I find him fascinating. So he was born to sort of lower middle class family in El Salvador in 1917. He was the second of 8 kids, and they were a city family. They weren't rural. He started out as learning to be a carpenter, but he felt called to the priesthood and he went to seminary. And he was a little baby priest. He was a little young priest. He went to the major seminary in San Salvador in 1937, but he was soon sent to Rome because they thought he was extremely smart. He was ordained a priest in Rome in 1942, and he thought he was going to get a PhD in theology, but then fascism hit and ruined the party.
Oh, rats.
As it so often does. And he was sent back to El Salvador. And he was appointed to the cathedral in San Miguel, where he worked for 20 years, kind of being a faithful and quiet priest, unremarkable. So fast forward to 1967, he's made Monsignor. He's brought back to San Salvador to be the secretary of the Bishops' Conference. And he befriends another priest named Rutilio Grande, who is going to become important. He's made auxiliary bishop, and then he's made full bishop, and he's sent to Santiago de Maria, which is a rural diocese out in the hinterlands where they grow coffee. This is pretty important. El Salvador continues to have, and had at that time, an incredible gulf between rich and poor.
Right.
Something like 77% of the arable land was owned by 0.01% of the population.
Which is staggering, to say the least.
It's mind-blowing. And coffee was the chief thing you grew and the chief thing you exported. And coffee prices were always going up and down, particularly at this time because of the world wars. And so the effect of that situation on the people in the rural areas who grew the coffee was, at this point when he's made bishop, beginning to become apparent to him. But he's known as being really conservative and studious and boring. He picks a fight with the Jesuits when he's the bishop, and he tells them that their high school education program is too Marxist.
Wow.
And they need to shut it down. Yeah. He gets into this public debate, and all of the conservatives are like, he's great. We love him so much. He's going after the Jesuits. He is like the paragon of conservatism at this point. Things start to change in the mid-70s. The unrest in El Salvador gets worse. The National Guard begins to up their aggression towards people agitating for greater economic equality. 5 campesinos, or farmers, are shot and killed when they're protesting in his diocese. And he's really upset. He writes a letter of protest. But he's still, not doing a whole lot, you know. He's made Archbishop of the entire country in February of 1977. And the reason he's elevated is because everyone kind of sees him as boring and conservative and not going to rock the boat.
He's a safe bet.
He's a safe bet, yeah. When he's made archbishop, the country had just come through a fraudulent election for president. The military is any parallels to current events are totally coincidental. There are massive violent protests that are being cracked down on by the military. We're beginning to see the development of death squads, which kind of were renegade militias that would go around and murder and disappear people that seemed to be rising up against the right-wing government. So Romero seemed to be the safe bet. He seemed to be the way to keep things calm in Dodge and seemed to be a way to keep the people in line. The month after he becomes archbishop, his friend Rutio Grande and 2 companions are assassinated as they go out to the country to say mass for farmers. They're pulled off the bus and they're killed by a death squad. For Romero, this is pointed to as this kind of road to Damascus moment. Scholars kind of trace a development of his theology developing before this, and you can definitely see the through lines, but at this point, he decides enough is enough. When Father Grande is killed, Romero orders all churches in the diocese closed, and he says, okay, everything is closed. We're going to have one mass this Sunday. It will be the funeral mass. It will be the cathedral in San Salvador, and I am preaching. And for a Catholic country where it's an obligation to attend mass,
right,
it meant that no one could avoid confronting what had happened. A priest had been martyred. Such a badass move. I love it so much. And so he begins to confront in his sermons, in the way he leads the church, what is happening to the people. He says, I am a shepherd who with his people has begun to learn a beautiful and difficult truth. Our faith requires that we immerse ourselves in the world. I believe economic injustice is the root cause of our problems. From it stems all the violence. From this point on, there is a steady roll of priests being murdered by death squads and the National Guard, because liberation theology as an idea had kind of become really popular in El Salvador. What priests would do is go out to these small rural communities and say, you have the power to interpret scripture for yourselves. How does scripture speak to the conditions you are in? I don't know if you know this, Adam, but if you actually read the gospel, scripture is liberatory, and it tells us that God does not want us to suffer.
right.
In fact, God wants us to be free and live lives of wholeness and health. And God has quite a lot to say about the systems of the world that would prevent that from happening.
It's almost like it talks a little bit about empire, a little bit.
Yeah, talks a little bit about empire and people who, pervert the course of justice and people who hoard all the land and don't give you any of it and take your earnings. The gospel has a lot to say about that. So when you give people that, they get really frustrated with the way things are. And it is very subversive. And the government had figured that out.
And this is actually, if I could just add something from a Catholic perspective, just knowing my history of the church, up basically until this point, right about here in the course of the history of the Catholic Church and really kind of the church at large, the Bible was off limits for people who didn't have a collar.
Right.
Like if you weren't clergy,
Yeah.
you weren't allowed, like literally told, you are not supposed to read this. And the fact that now they're giving it back to the people and literally asking them what they thought about it is wildly revolutionary.
Yeah.
And it seems so mundane to us now, but back then it's like, this is crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he talks a lot, if you read his sermons and if you read his diary, he talks a lot about God being present in the people and his authority to lead and to be the church, being present in the people. And so he kind of explicitly derives his authority and his authority as bishop from what the people need and what the people feel, which is a complete reversal of how you traditionally think of the church's hierarchy as acting. The church's hierarchy acts and the people are supposed to follow. But Romero very explicitly reverses that. And it's really fascinating. So we have this constant drumbeat of priests and church workers being assassinated and disappeared. 2 months after Father Grande is martyred, the priest in Aguilares is martyred. The death squads go into the rectory, shoot him in the head. The National Guard takes over the town, barracks themselves in the cathedral, stamps out the reserved sacrament from behind the altar. Which, we talk about these things as Americans, and it's one level of kind of hitting us. If you are sort of from the Salvadoran culture and it's a deeply Catholic culture in a particularly symbolic way. And so it has a really visceral, like, sense of violation if that happens in your town. They took Jesus and they stamped him.
Right.
And so he makes a special trip to Aguilares and reconsecrates the cathedral and makes everyone show up. So he begins to do all these things to directly confront what is happening to the people. Meanwhile, his bishops are not on board.
Mm.
One of the things I like reading his diaries is he doesn't outright complain about the bishops, but he definitely throws some shade at them. He's like,
he subtweets them all.
Yeah, he's like, yeah, nobody showed up at this meeting I called. I think they complained to the Vatican about me again. I'm really kind of frustrated. They told me another bishop met with me and told me to play nice with the president, and I explained that I'm having trouble playing nice with the president when 2 of my priests were just killed. So the bishops as a whole, and there are some who stand with him, but the bishops as a whole are not on board with this confrontational move. But Romero starts to list the names of those disappeared in his sermons each week from the National Cathedral. He starts to kind of catalog things that have happened to the people each week in his sermons, and he uses the diocesan radio station to broadcast the Mass every week. And so he's got a direct pipeline to tell the truth about what's happening in the country in a way that can't be stopped, except when it was bombed. They bombed the radio station several times.
I remember that more than once.
Yeah.
The government bombed the radio station to try and shut it down, which, again, to give context to all of us, like, we look at things like Mass on the radio or church on the radio, we're like, what is this? Well, I mean, this is essentially live streaming before there was ever live streaming. And especially in developing countries where there is the access to a national blanket television network doesn't exist. The fact that they actually built and produced from their own radio station, as a broadcast nerd, it's pretty impressive. And that keeps getting wiped out over and over again.
Yeah, by some estimates, something like 73% of the rural population listen to his Mass every week.
Which is amazing.
Which is insane. And 47% of the urban population. So you imagine this guy in his sermons every week with that large of a megaphone to talk to people every week. And in his sermons, he would say, you are the hands of the church, you and your taxi cab, you and your fruit stall. You are the hands and feet of the church. When you are hurt, you are being crucified like Christ was. Your suffering is not meaningless. Your suffering brings about the redemption of El Salvador. He would directly tie what the people were going through and their struggles for equality with the theology of the church. And so he brought meaning to everything that was happening. And he brought attention to it. He made it so it mattered. And he was adored. The people adored him. He was only Archbishop for 3 years. In those 3 years, there were 2 separate investigations of what he was doing by the Vatican. They sent first the Argentinian bishop to check on him, and then they sent somebody else. Each time he would fly to Rome and have a personal audience with the Pope and sort of explain. And each time it seems like the Pope, at least initially, John VI, would kind of back down and kind of come around. Because again, Romero is not a firebrand. He was very careful in his sermons and his preaching and his teaching to explain that what he was advocating was a wholesale redemption of the Salvadoran people that would solve the material oppression because the roots of sin had been erased. So he drew those things as inextricably entwined. Mm-hmm. And he said, you cannot have one without the other. If we just embrace wholesale material revolution, like some Marxists did, because there were some Jesuits who took up arms, and he was not on board with that, then we're just going to be back here in 10 years. We have to have a wholesale societal revolution of values, of culture, where we learn to value ourselves, where we learn to value everyone as a beloved child of God and an image of God. And until we do that, we are not going to be able to solve our problems. So he was very clear and articulate about where his motives were coming from and why he was doing what he was doing. But each time he had to like fly to the Vatican, explain it to the Pope, and the Pope's like, okay. So Paul VI he brought around. John Paul II, not so much. The day he was martyred, there was a letter removing him from office on John Paul II's desk that was never signed. But
Wow. That's crazy.
yeah. So again, he was only Archbishop for 3 years. By the time we get to 1980, he was receiving constant death threats. And he was aware, if you read his sermons, he starts talking about when I die, if I die. He says, if I die, I will rise again in the Salvadoran people. His last Sunday sermon, he makes a direct plea. I know there's been controversy recently about whether or not it's okay to directly address people from the pulpit. Oscar Romero did it. He directly addresses his fellow Salvadorans who are in the death squads. And he says, lay down your weapons. There is a higher law than the one you are following. The law of God says, stop the killing. And I beg you, in the name of our God, stop the killing. And then the next day, on March 24th, he was celebrating daily mass for nuns that he lived with at a cancer hospice. And he was martyred by a member of a death squad as he was celebrating. His funeral occurred the next Sunday, which was Palm Sunday. There were crowds and crowds of people who tried to attend, but the army attacked the funeral and threw bombs into the crowd. The ensuing massacre killed probably between 30 and 50 people, and was one of the events that led directly to the Salvadoran Civil War that kicked off.
So let me ask you a question about this,
Yeah.
Megan. Okay. I love the story of Oscar Romero, and I can see why we as people who practice the Episcopal faith would be drawn to him. But I'm going to ask you this when it comes to Romero, and I guess how we look at sainthood altogether. Why is it that there are some, like, to me, if I have my Catholic brain turned on, we would never look at clergy from another church and be like, we want that one, and like try and like make them a saint. So it's just pretty remarkable to me that the Episcopal Church will look at clergy from another church and be like, we want that one. So is this a pretty, I mean, like you said kind of before, it's kind of a common practice that like we're looking at people who are living exemplary lives. But the best part about it, like you said, and get into this a little bit more, people who maybe sometimes make some mistakes and aren't always the best people. Talk about that.
Well, number one, I think it's hard not to call somebody a saint if they literally get massacred while they're celebrating the Eucharist. Like, that
Right.
is a little bit of a gimme. But also, so one of the Episcopal Church's charisms is that we don't really, and we never really have, thought of ourselves as the only church in existence. From the start, due to our very muddled way of coming into being, we have always seen ourselves as in continuity with the small c Catholic Church worldwide.
Right.
Other Catholics disagree how much in community we are with them, but we, sitting in the corner waving our little party banners, insist that we are still in communion with everybody. They just don't recognize it yet. One day they will. It'll be a nice party. And so we adopt as saints, people from the Roman Catholic Church, people from the Orthodox Church, because we see our commonalities with them. Romero was in a lot of conversations with the Anglican Church, particularly because the United States was not super helpful to him, but the British Anglican Church was. And so particularly around the cause of his sainthood in the Roman Catholic Church, it was English Catholics that pushed for it, like the Archbishop Romero Trust. So he had a special relationship with the UK and with the British Parliament. And so there's a kind of nice friendship that has always existed. There's a statue of him at, I think, Westminster Abbey. And in a lot of ways, what he articulated and the liberation theology that he espoused has come over into the Episcopal Church because it was so squashed by Roman Catholicism under John Paul II and Benedict, and not so much Francis. But when that happened, it became adopted by the Episcopal Church. So that's part of it too.
Well, what else are the things that we need to know about saints in the Episcopal Church? I know we're going to talk about this probably more. We're going to obviously, now we got a segment, Know Your Saints. What are we going to talk about? What else do you feel like our listeners should know about saints?
I mean, I think particularly about Romero, it's not that he did everything right. He was kind of grumpy. I found out this time, and I thought I knew like the outlines of his life. He apparently sought psychiatric help because he had OCD in the 60s, which made me like him more, honestly. But he struggled with scrupulosity and kind of wrestled with that, which makes a lot of sense, having read his writings. But the idea of sainthood being somebody who lived out their faith in a way that is instructive for us. And so Romero, particularly in this moment, I feel like lived out his faith in a way that is instructive for the church today. He allowed himself to be changed by the people that he served, and he allowed himself to be at risk for the people that he served. And when they were at risk, he was at risk. Very much like a bishop of old.
And that, especially too, that like this act of both solidarity and defiance, those are holy acts. That those are acts rooted in holiness, in closeness to Jesus, and that those are things that maybe we need to be mindful of.
And his clarity about the suffering of human beings being an affront to God, and that the church has to speak up about that. There's no, as a church, you have no other option. You can't play softball. You can't, bow and scrape. You have to stand up when the people are being oppressed. That is something, and when you do that, you have to risk everything the church has. His clarity about what the church could be, and what the church ought to be, I think is so instructive for us as we try and reclaim the prophetic voice of the church post-Christendom. And I mean, I have some quotes. When we struggle for human rights, for freedom, for dignity, when we feel that it is a ministry of the church to concern itself for those who are hungry, for those who have no schools, for those who are deprived, we are not departing from God's promise. He comes to free us from sin, and the church knows that sin's consequences are all such injustices and abuses. The church knows that it is saving the world when it undertakes to speak also of such things. So he has this like really amazing clarity about why he is saying the things he's saying, and he roots it in this really orthodox incarnational faith. I mean, and I can quibble with some of the things he says. Believes in gender roles, probably wouldn't be a fan of women's ordination.
Which is hard because, again, like we take these people that we develop such a deep affinity for and we see the value in what they do. But again, like you talked about, we are looking at people who are people. They are fallible people. I almost said infallible. They are fallible. They make mistakes. They have lapses in judgment. They don't lead perfect lives, but they can be kind of a goalpost for us to try and strive for when it comes to how we live our life and our faith.
But what motivated him was this kind of crystal clear vision of what the church ought to be, what it should be fighting for, whose side it should be on. And I find that so inspiring and motivating, particularly now.
Mm-hmm. Which is something we need to think about and be mindful of, especially here and now. All right, Megan, as always, we need a recommendation from you for this week. So I'm going to ask you for a 2-for-1.
Okay.
What's a good piece of spiritual reading we can do for the week?
Ooh, okay.
And what's a piece of non-spiritual reading you think we should do for the week?
Ooh, okay. So spiritual reading is an easy one. The Violence of Love by Oscar Romero, which is a book of excerpts from his sermons. Excellent. Non-spiritual reading, I'm going to have to go with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams.
Great pick. So you guys heard it here. For your reading list, add it to your reading list. The Violence of Love by Oscar Romero, and of course, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And because it's coming from a priest, it's not just a good idea, it's an order. We'll see you guys next time. Make sure that you check out the show. Make sure you like it. Make sure you leave us a review because we're greedy and we want you to like us. And we will talk to you guys next time. Take care. Thanks for stopping by and checking out For the Rest of Us with Canon Megan. If you like the show, maybe subscribe, share it with a friend, leave us a review, and we hope to see you again next time. For the Rest of Us is a production of the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York.